John Wesley Hardin, the real outlaw, who was spelled without the G at the end of his name, was one of the most vicious killers in the Old West. Certainly did hurt a number of honest men. Good morning, and welcome to another episode of the Clarion Call and my continuing series of Deciphering Dylan. You know, headlines from the current news cycle reminded me of this song from long ago, almost 60 years ago now. The title cut from the John Wesley Hardin album that Bob Dylan came out with. It was his second album that he recorded in Nashville, and it really shows the influence of a more country sound. Blonde on Blonde was also recorded down there, but that one we were still hearing the rock and roll Dylan. But then shortly after that one was released, he had his motorcycle accident. He didn't do much for a year or two, and then when he reemerged, it was quite a shock to everyone who was a Dylan fan and everyone who was a music fan at that time, because what he came up with was so different from the rock and roll Dylan that we were just getting adjusted to. And he came in with a very spare sound. This song in particular, all you can hear is Bob on the guitar and harmonica, and then a bass player and a drummer, and that's it. Gone were the big productions of like a Rolling Stone and all the rock and roll lead guitars and organs and all that. Very, very spare production. So we'll play a little bit of this, and then we'll talk about who John Wesley Hardin really was. It's not the way he's being portrayed by Bob, I can tell you that much.
John Wesley Hardin was a friend to the poor. He traveled with a gun in every hand. All along this countryside he opened many a door, but he was never known to hurt an honest man.
Probably the only sentence in that entire first verse that might have been true was that he traveled with a gun in every hand. He certainly was no friend to the poor, and he certainly did hurt a number of honest men. John Wesley Hardin, the real outlaw, who was spelled without the G at the end of his name, was one of the most vicious killers in the Old West. He lived in Texas after the Civil War, killed his first person at age 15, and nobody knows exactly how many he killed, but it was in the dozens until he was eventually put in jail. While he was in jail, he wrote an autobiography hoping to clear his name, but I don't think it succeeded because he revealed himself to be not only a vicious killer, but also a racist, in that he killed a lot of black people, a lot of Mexicans, a lot of Indians, just because he didn't really care for them. So what is Bob doing here, glorifying this guy who had such a vicious life? I'm not really sure. I'm sure of one thing. I'm sure Bob knew the true story of John Wesley Hardin. Bob knows a lot. Bob reads a lot. Bob knew that the picture he was painting was a total fantasy. Some kind of a Robin Hood who went around helping the poor people. No, that wasn't the real John Wesley Hardin. Was he making fun of glorification of criminals? Perhaps. You know, Bob's always been ahead of his time. And certainly we've seen a lot of glorification of bad people throughout American history. You know, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Pretty Boy Floyd, the outlaw. Right up to modern times, where we have Luigi, who killed the insurance executive, and the people that are bombing the Tesla dealerships. In some quarters, those people are considered heroes. So I think Bob may be pointing out the danger of glorifying people who really were vicious. It's kind of ironic, the racist angle, when you consider that Bob made his name as a folk singer, singing at civil rights demonstrations, wrote a number of civil rights songs. The Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll comes to mind. Other civil rights anthems. and yet here he is glorifying a racist who killed black people. Very odd indeed.
'Twas down in Cheney County, the time they talk about. With his lady by his side, he took a stand. And soon the situation there was all but straightened out. For he was always known to lend a helping hand.
A great harmonica solo, a great drumming and bass backing to this song. But what was most shocking, I think, about this album when it came out was Bob's voice. It was a totally different voice that we'd really ever heard before. And just the spareness of the music was in such contrast to everything that had come before with Bob and everything that was going on in the culture at that time. I mean, 67, 68. We had Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Band come out with the Beatles. All kinds of very intricate psychedelic music was in the air. And Bob just went the other direction entirely. He just did a stripped down country version, which just shows he's always marched to his own tune, his own drummer. He's never followed the crowd. In fact, he really was leading the crowd back to something that had more of a roots in Americana than a lot of the psychedelic stuff that was going on. As far as the lyrics, always known to lend a helping hand, I don't think so. If you know anything about this guy, he didn't help anybody else except himself. He was pretty much a pathological killer. Not sure about the incident in Cheney County. In fact, I don't think Cheney County actually exists. So that whole thing where he took a stand and the situation was all but straightened out, very, very vague. We don't know what he's talking about there, but most likely he killed somebody down Cheney County because that's what he did.
All across the telegraph, his name it did resound. But no charge held against him could they prove. And there was no man around who could track or chain him down. He was never known to make a foolish move.
So there you have it. What's it all about, Alfie? I don't know. That part of the story is partly true that he was somewhat difficult to track or chain down. He kept escaping from jail. One time, somebody gave him a hacksaw. He hacked his way out of one jail. They had a hard time capturing him. He killed a lot of lawmen, a lot of members of posses who came from. He had a way of ambushing them, knowing they were coming, and then killing them before they had a chance to catch him. So that part at least was true, but the rest of the story, some kind of a Robin Hood, totally made up. Also, along with the spareness of the album, look at the artwork on the cover. Those two guys on either side of him were Bengal balls. In other words, they were musicians from Bengal, India, I believe. They're not American Indians, although they look like they could be. The guy in the back is just some random friend of his from Woodstock, New York. But if you just look at the three, black and white photograph, Bob is wearing, kind of his Western outlaw look. And he chose this song to title the album. Now, the album itself is very, very different from anything that had come before. Kind of pointed the way more toward his Jesus period, which would follow, a dozen years later. Everything was spare, right down to the album art, which was very hard to fathom. People have studied that picture and Some people thought they saw the Beatles in that tree trunk behind him. Unintentional, apparently. I think this is a long tradition of glorifying outlaws. So Bob has added a new hero and a very unlikely one. And what is he really saying about that situation? Well, only Bob knows. But it did remind me of a way in our culture we glorify people that probably should not be glorified.